going into it, I had high hopes, but I just left disappointed. But he was no Frank Dodd, okay? He was no Frank Dodd. Let's get this straight. The real monsters are the ones inside of us. Would you kill baby Hitler? Hi, I'm a considered wannabe, and the 5th book I decided to read from Stephen King is in fact The Dead Zone. My overall impressions from this book is I feel very conflicted about it. I liked some aspects of it and I didn't like some aspects of it. So The Dead Zone is the first book in the Castle Rock series, and it takes place with Johnny Smith getting into a coma and stays there for 4.5 years, and then gains psychic powers afterwards where, he can touch somebody and say, bro, your fucking air fryer is about to explode. Throughout the book, I liked the first half of it, specifically when he's in the coma and then gets out of it. I like the whole family dynamic of his mom going crazy Christian and believing that God is going to beam you up from a UFO to save people from the rapture and stuff. That part there was really good because it showed how his mom was grasping at strings, trying to cope with her son, who is essentially a vegetable. So that was really strong, as well as his dad being like, fuck man, why is this happening to us? I have to deal with my wife going crazy, but he understands why. And I think Stephen King adds a very unique element, which he didn't have to, but he did, was the whole part with his girlfriend, Sarah. What are you supposed to do if your partner goes into a coma for 4.5 years? Do you patiently wait, or do you take a more pragmatic approach of, yeah, this person's probably never gonna come out of this coma and we're gonna have to pull the plug? And I think that was honestly one of the stronger parts of this book, in my opinion, because Stephen King asked some real life questions that people have had to figure out for themselves. And, when she ultimately decides to move on from that whole relationship and make a new life, that's a big, big decision. And when they finally end up meeting afterwards, Johnny and Sarah, that is, they have that intimate moment of, okay, let's finish this right. Even that in itself is a whole other can of worms. Is this taboo? This is cheating. That whole aspect of that book was good because it really showed a very human element that Stephen King is, in my opinion, so far in my journey, very good at doing. What I especially liked was the whole part of disbelief when he'd be touching people and people just not believe him, people just thinking that he's a hoax, he's the devil. And here you have this normal guy, this ordinary guy called John Smith, of all names, and he's thrown into this very extraordinary situation that he's ill-equipped for. And he is just trying to live his life, but because of what has happened, people see him as some savior, some prophet. And again, it's different from what I was expecting from Stephen King starting this journey. I thought it was just going to be horror, blood, gore, monsters. And we have this very different book actually quite early on in his career, right? The Castle Rock part of this book I thought was really fun because I thought the whole Frank Dodd story was pretty compelling because, as we know, Frank Dodd is the Castle Rock Strangler and he does some pretty heinous shit to people, right? We see how Johnny Smith gets incorporated into Castle Rock when Sheriff Bannerman, tries to contact him because he needs help for a case, right? And that is pretty smart, pretty seamless. And when we get the whole resolution of the story and we find out it's Frank Dodd and they got to go to his house and that this guy freaking unalives himself it's wild. And knowing that his mom also was involved in creating this monster and enabling him is pretty dark. You know, that sort of stuff. I really enjoyed that because it's like Stephen King is discreetly kind of saying that the real monsters are the ones inside of us. You don't have to look for a vampire. You don't have to look like the monster from Frankenstein. You don't have to look like a werewolf to be scary. You know, humans in themselves are likely the most scariest monster that we can actually create because of so many atrocities that we've caused in this world. And I think that is probably what Stephen King, at least in this part of the book, is at least trying to maybe convey. Now we get to the Greg Stillson part. You know, early on in the book, we see that Greg Stillson literally like kills a dog, kicks it and stuff. Like, Greg Stillson, he's not a very good guy, as we can see. And throughout the story, we kind of see bits and pieces of how this character gets implemented into the whole Dead Zone. And eventually, once things settle down with Johnny Smith, he gets into politics and he likes to go to the rallies. And he shakes hands with people, and he gets the strong premonition from Greg Stillson that he's essentially going to cause a nuclear war in the future. And that is the question of, would you kill baby Hitler, right? So it's an interesting question for me anyway. I thought the execution of it was not the best, in my opinion. And or I can say it didn't vibe with me. I thought that after the whole Frank Dodd situation, I felt like the story was quite slow, and I just didn't care for Greg Stillson as a character as much as I should have. And because he didn't really do anything crazy yet. You know, we've seen him do some back alley dark shit, like trying bribing people, threatening people, that sort of stuff. But he was no Frank Dodd, okay? He was no Frank Dodd. Let's get this straight. So you even had John Smith literally questioning himself. I'm like, is this really what I saw, right? And that's fair because like it's the strongest thing he's ever seen, and he's unsure. He's unsure. And this is the part of the story where it just got me. I just got lost. I'm just like, man, where are we going with this? Like, what's happening? John Smith becomes a tutor for some rich guy, helps some kid with his reading issues. I just felt like some parts of the book felt long for that. I'm like, do we really need this, right? It felt as though since this book is separated in 3 parts, it felt like the whole Greg Stillson part was a whole separate book. Now, I understand that the book is about Johnny Smith, and this is his novel, this is his story, but it just didn't vibe with me. And once we get to the part where he decides to commit to killing Greg Stillson, again, I just felt like I wasn't captured. I wasn't enamored by the whole plot. I wasn't convinced. I was like, really? Like, okay, like we're gonna kill him. However, I will say I did like the whole part how like everyone kept on mentioning like, yo, dude, you look fucking horrible, bro. You look like you haven't slept, your bloodshot eyes, like you look like a living husk. You know, that whole part where he becomes obsessed with it, that I liked, but I just, overall, that whole part just did not capture me as a reader. What I will say though, is the way that he misses his, he fucks up his assassination attempt, but Greg Stillson ends up taking a kid as like a human meat shield. That was an interesting part of the book I wasn't expecting. I was legitimately expecting, yeah, let's go, let's blast Greg Stillson, let's move on. And of course, the whole letters at the end were, moving to some degree. Again, I wasn't invested as much as other readers. Going into it, I had high hopes, but I just left disappointed. It's not the type of story that I would read personally. So I don't want to say this is a shit book because art is subjective. So I don't want to be very blunt in that. In this political landscape, this book is really scary. And it's scary because of what is like happening now in 2025, especially recently. It's uncomfortable to think of, you know, people getting assassinated, whether it was the Donald Trump assassination attempt or the Charlie Kirk assassination. I just kept on thinking about like the parallels with this book in some aspects, and it just makes me feel like just kind of nasty. It's kind of disgusted by the whole idea of like assassinating people. This plot is, you know, it's written back in, I think, 1979, and we're seeing stuff very similar to it nowadays. While I didn't like the book fully, I still thought that it deserves a decent score. So yeah, I'll give The Dead Zone a 4 on 10. It wasn't for me, but I definitely see aspects of it that are strong, and I see aspects of the book that, while I didn't like, I'm sure other people would enjoy wholeheartedly. So there we go. Stephen King, forever.